Hi, Peter Charles here of Hooked for Life Fly Fishing, and today I'd like to talk about fly line ratings and the rating system. It's causing a lot of confusion these days, and people are saying things like, I wish fly line companies would stick to the standard. All we need to do is stick to the standard and all this confusion will go away. Other people think that the fly line companies have abandoned the standard. Well, I'd like to talk about how these assertions aren't really accurate. Companies have not thrown the standard out the window, but the standard isn't the end-all be-all. It doesn't cover the broad range of things that fly fishermen do these days. It was very limited in its original inception. So let's talk about that for a moment. The system came into effect around 1960. It was created to deal with a situation where new fly lines were coming on the market that were built out of plastic and not silk. And so we needed a different way to rate them. Plus we were moving away from bamboo rods to fiberglass rods, and they loaded differently. So the old rating system that was based on fly line diameter didn't work anymore. They came out with a new system based on weight, and this was done by the American Fishing Tackle Manufacturers Association, or AFTMA. And they came out with a standard that rated lines by the weight of the first 30 foot of the fly line. So they took the first 30 feet of the fly line and said, how much does this weigh? And then from there, they came up with a rating system. Now that sounds great until you realize that the rating system was built for trout fishing. It's really a trout rating system. It's very arbitrary. They decided 30 feet because that's a typical distance for fly fishermen to cast. And when we look at the system and think about it for a minute, then we realize that a line that's weighted to cast 30 feet may not be the best choice to cast 90 feet. And therein lies the problem. When we try to build fly lines that do different jobs, we find that that old standard of building a line to the first 30 feet doesn't work very well. We need a different standard. So let's look at a few fly lines that I have here, and we'll talk about how those fly lines are built and how they either relate to the standard or they don't relate to the standard, and why it's important to know that these are not lines that are made wrong, but they're made to do a certain job. So let's start off with this good old double taper line. Traditional taper, it's probably one of the earliest tapers ever made in fly line construction, and it is a perfect example of a line that is built to the AFTMA standard. You can put this on a standard 4-weight rod and it's going to work just fine. However, if I wanted to cast a line like this a long way, I would start to run into difficulty. If we took a regular weight forward line, you say, well, how about a weight forward line? Would that help? Even then, I'm still going to run into difficulty. And the reason is the weight of a normal weight forward line is not heavy enough to load the rod deeply enough to be able to cast for distance. As simple as that. To cast further, we need heavier. And if you think that's not true, if I cast 50 foot of this line, or aerialize 50 foot of this line, it's very, very heavy. It's close to double the AFTMA rating for the line. So my 4-weight rod could handle 50 foot of this line out of the rod guides, and it would be handling in the neighborhood of 220, 230 grains. So it can handle a lot more than just the rating system or 120 grains. So when you think about that, fly line manufacturers came up with another option, which is called a distance taper. And the distance taper is a weight forward line with a very long head. That's simple. That's all it is. And the reason for that is that long head provides the weight to load the rod sufficiently for casting for distance. So this head is 50 to 60 foot long, for example, in a typical distance taper, and you need that 50 to 60 foot long head to load a line to cast it far. Very, very simple. If your line is too short, too light, it won't do the job. Now there's a problem. Aerializing 50 to 60 foot of line can be difficult for a lot of people. So manufacturers responded to that, and they produced a line like this 40 plus. And essentially, when you look at these two lines, you realize that the 40 plus is only 36 foot long, but it weighs the same amount as this distance taper that is in the neighborhood of 55 foot long. So what Airflow did in this case, and what other companies have done as well, is they've taken this distance line and compressed its mass into a shorter head, like this 40 plus. Now all of a sudden, beginners have a line, or even intermediate casters have a line that is heavy enough to cast for distance, but is not difficult to cast because the head is short. So that's all they've done with a lot of these short head overweight designs, is simply taken the weight of a distance taper and compressed it into a shorter head. And that enables people to cast a heavy head that'll go a far distance and yet not struggle to aerialize 50 to 60 foot line out of the guides. Now there's other problems as well. In the old days, we just fished for trout and salmon. These days we're fishing for striped bass, bonefish, tarpon, marlin, carp. I mean, the originators of the AFTMA rating system, I don't think ever thought of somebody going out with a fly rod and catching a 40-pound carp with it. So the requirements we have for our lines have changed greatly because of the various number of species we chase with fly rods these days. These days we're casting a broad variety of flies, and from the very tiny to the very big. I mean, let's take a look at these pike flies in relationship to the fly box there. It's huge. Yet, look at these tiny trout flies. Now, it's ridiculous to think we could cast both flies using the same line. I mean, I'm not going to use a little tiny weight forward 4-weight or double taper 4-weight and try and cast that thing with it. I'm going to need a specialized fly line to move a fly of that size, or a fly of this size. Yet if I was to try and use that same fly line to cast these tiny flies, it'll be a disaster as well. So what manufacturers have done is they've taken fly lines and developed specialized tapers that will handle anything from these tiny flies to these huge flies. As a perfect example, we have lines like this bass muskie taper, and it's designed to toss over those very large flies. Its characteristics are simple. It has a very blunt front taper, a thick tip, it tends to be a bit overweight, and the head is relatively short. And it's designed that way to turn over these big monster flies. So if I tried to take a standard weight forward line that we used 30, 40, 50 years ago and cast that big monster pike fly, it's not going to go very far. Now, when we're talking about pike flies, I ran into this situation many years ago when casting a pike line that I bought. And it illustrates this problem perfectly. This goes back about 15 years. I bought a pike line that was 30 foot long, and it weighed exactly 280 grains over 30 feet. It was a 10 weight, and it was bang on the right weight rating for a 10 weight. Here's the problem. It didn't work on my rod. I mean, there was nothing wrong with the rod. I cast 30, 40, 50 feet, no problem. As soon as I put a big fly on it and tried to go 70, 80 feet, it was horrible. It just fell out of the air. It wouldn't do anything. I was flogging it like mad to make it work. Later on, I took my 8-weight rod, put the same 10-weight line on it, put the big flies on it, and it went like a rocket. I mean, it was great. It did exactly what it was supposed to do. And the point here wasn't that my 10-weight rod wasn't a 10-weight, or my 8-weight was a 10-weight. No, my 8-weight was a real 8-weight, my 10-weight was a real 10-weight. It was the fact that the line was too light to do the job of casting 70, 80 feet with a big fly. It would cast a small fly 50, 60 feet, but that's what the rating system was designed to do. Cast small flies 20, 30, 40, 50 feet. When we get beyond that, the rating system breaks down. And we have to use heavier lines to do the job. And that's what I found. As soon as I put my 10-weight line on the 8-weight rod, bingo, it worked. And guess what? When we get to lines like this 40-plus line, it's essentially that, 2 line weights over. This one's a 5-weight, but it's essentially the same weight as a 7-weight line over that distance, that length ahead. So you're putting a 7-weight rated line on your 5-weight rod, and guess what? It's not overrated. Your 5-weight handles it perfectly. So don't be afraid to experiment. The AFTMA standard isn't a straitjacket. You can step outside the box and do different things with your modern graphite fly rod. So for example, I have this 8-weight bass muskie taper here. I use it on a 6-weight at times when I have to cast a really big fly. So if you have to cast a big fly, go heavy. If you have to cast further, go heavy. And trust the manufacturers when they give you a line that's rated for a 6-weight but weighs the same as an 8-weight, that they know what they're doing. They're building that line that way for a reason. They're building it heavy to allow you to cast bigger flies and to cast them farther, and to exploit the power that's in a modern graphite rod. So The bottom line is here, the AFTMA standard is great for trout fishing, but as soon as we move beyond that, then we have to look at a broader variety of lines, which means heavier lines, thicker lines, shorter tapers, whatever it takes to get the job done. And that's what the fly line manufacturers have done. They've built lines to do that. So don't be afraid to try them. Don't be afraid to experiment. You'd be surprised what you'll be able to do. So give it a whirl and go fishing.